Would you rather play this game at 10 frames per second or at a slightly lower resolution? Decisions.
Dude, oh my god. The stupid performance versus fidelity argument goes all the way back to the N64. Oh my god.
Yes, indeed.
No, I would say it argues as the console war started.
Anyway, this is Castlevania 64, Actually Good This Time edition, also known as Legacy of Darkness. A lot of people think that this is just like a shitty prequel or sequel or whatever.
Or sequel,
yeah. But that's mostly because Konami didn't want the developers to call it Castlevania Special Edition. It's actually more of like a Sonic 3 and Knuckles situation, in a way where they had to release the game in an obviously like incomplete state, and then like less than a year later they released a different version of it. Anyway.
Yeah, that's more of a Capcom thing than a Konami thing, historically.
Anyway, those of you listening really good to the game audio beneath our ramblings will have noticed a little chime on the title screen there. That's because I used the Konami Code to bypass having to play as Cornell first. The game forces you to go through the prequel story before you can play the actual, like, game that they released initially. And I assume that's because Konami wanted people to perceive this as a completely new game so it would sell more copies, theoretically. Well...
Say theoretically, that's exactly the reason why they did it.
No, so that it would theoretically sell more copies. It didn't. I don't think. So...
Yeah, this is one of the, like, least talked about Castlevanias ever. Like, you get more people talking about the original Castlevania 64, because, oh, that game's real bad. I know it's more complicated than that, and I know that this game being a semi-remake sequel special edition fixes many of those problems. But when it comes to the Castlevania games, the only games I can think of that are talked about less than this one are, like, the Game Boy games and the PS2 3D games.
No, you're more likely to run into someone talking about Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness before someone talks about 64. Honestly, I put this in terms of just notoriety or people just talking about it. I may be wrong about this, but I put 64 and Legacy of Darkness up there with Lords of Shadow. Because Lords of Shadow was a thing when it was recent, but it just fell off the face of the fucking earth afterwards.
Lords of Shadow is the reboot, right?
The God of War clone.
I mean, that still has notoriety. People talk about that in terms of, like...
Do they?
Well, not in a positive way, but people are like, oh... That people like to hate on that game, you know, similarly to from what Lewis has told me of this. People like to hate on that game more than it necessarily deserves because it breaks from the mold of the Castlevania tradition. As opposed to, like, looking at it as a God of War.
I'm not even just getting into, like, whether it was positively received or negatively received, just talking about it in the first place. Like, anybody talk about Lord of Shadow.
Occasionally hear people remember it fondly, but, you know, it's one of those things, like, where the hardcore fan base of Castlevania really doesn't give a shit because it's really not a Castlevania game at heart. And I don't mean that in the sense of, oh, Gabriel Belmont isn't a true Belmont or other story considerations like that. I mean, it's a fucking God of War game.
Yeah, it's like it's a God of War game. It's like it's not a dig against the God of War series. It's like, this is not Castlevania.
And you know, I realize, like, for the people who are seriously into Lords of Shadow, that's a gross oversimplification. But it is at its core closer to God of War than Castlevania on a mechanical level, and that's fine. It's a good God of War and it's a good game taken on its own terms. Now, Lords of Shadow 2 is kind of a mess, but, you know, I appreciate what it did, what both games do on their own terms, and I also appreciate that the Mirror of Fate spin-off on the 3DS was what ultimately got us a Metroid revival. Because, thank you, Mercury Steam.
One thing that I appreciate is that they somehow managed to get the Belmont strut to look exactly like how it looks in 2D in 3D, which I think cannot be easy considering how, like, have you ever tried the Belmont strut in real life? It's harder than you think. So It's definitely.
I know Lewis is using a different weapon at the moment, but I was looking at the default whip attack, and again, I have not played Legacy of Darkness or 64 for that matter, outside of a brief taste, and it's like, nah, I'm all right. But that whip animation, does that get upgraded like later down the road?
It's good that you mentioned that, because in the original Castlevania 64, you could get weapon upgrades just like in this game, but the only thing that would change about the whip was the color of the trail of the whip animation. Here in Legacy of Darkness, it has been upgraded so that it turns into the chain at level 2, and then a light whip at level 3, which is neat.
Cool. All right, but I'm talking more specifically the animation of attack, where it's like, crack that whip, like Licorice Whip. Like, because I'm thinking of Leon and Lament of Innocence. He fucking swung that shit vertically and horizontally because it's a fucking whip. That's what you're supposed to do with it.
We're working with the N64 here. I can already tell that, much like many games of its time, the camera seems to be fighting you along the way here, which is... It's one of the hard things about going back to games from this time is dealing with the camera. Camera technicians are, I think, probably the most underappreciated game devs of them all, because it's such a thankless job, but everybody hates you if you get it wrong. Is the thing. It's like, nobody says, oh man, this camera in this game's so good. Nobody ever literally says that.
So it's also good that you mentioned the camera, because guess what? Another thing that changed between Vanilla 64 and Legacy of Darkness is the fucking camera. Okay, so in Vanilla 64, the camera was like pulled quite a lot further back from the character than it is here, and there were 3 camera modes to cycle between rather than just 2. Side note, there was only one camera cycling button, so you had to go through all 3 every time you wanted to switch to another mode, and it was obnoxious. The 3 modes in the original game were normal view, action view, and battle view. Battle view would focus on enemies, straightforward enough, and normal view would be kind of like what we're seeing now in action view here, except when you held the reset the camera to behind you button, it would focus on enemies if there were any nearby. So, if you wanted to not focus on enemies so you can run the fuck away from combat, you needed to switch to what that game called Action View, which glued the camera to your character's ass. It would swing around at the slightest turn, and the few times I tried to use it, I swear to God, I almost got motion sickness.
The moment you said, like, the reset camera button was also the lock-on button. If enemies were near, you're like, oh, boy.
Yeah, so here in Legacy of Darkness, they've consolidated normal view and action view into just one mode called Action View. And what that means is you don't focus on enemies at all with the lock-on button. You have to switch to battle view for that, which is fine. There are only 2 modes, so you only need to tap a button to do that. But if you hold the reset the camera behind me button, it will actually fix the camera directly behind your character so that it will turn with you. It's actually pretty good that way. I like the camera in this game. It's a good camera for an N64 era 3D platformer, which is high praise indeed.
I can already tell that this game's much slower than your typical Castlevania.
So yeah, it is. It's got a lot of influence from, in particular, Resident Evil and Tomb Raider. You can see a lot of the DNA from those 2 series in the way this game handles platforming and level design. Lots of keys and door opening animations, which, to be fair, is actually something that, like, makes sense for a Castlevania game.
I mean, Castlevania was never hyper fast-paced. In comparison to many other games of its time, it's much more deliberate with its platforming and challenges. Like, if you compare to something like Mega Man, where the most infamous traps and platforming sections in Mega Man are, like, hyper fast. Oh, you need to dodge these lights, these lasers, or you die instantly. And, oh, jump from here, then here, then here, and you better not hesitate for half a second, otherwise you fall into the pit and die. Whereas Castlevania, generally speaking, gives you more time to think. And then, like, the more fast-paced parts of Castlevania, from what I can remember, are more the enemies. Like, oh, you've got this hallway with 30 enemies in it, and Medusa heads, so fuck you.
I would also depends, like, what what version of Castlevania are you playing? Are we talking Classicvania or are we talking Metroidvania?
Well, I'm talking about the classic games, because when this game came out, Metroidvania was still brand new. Like, Symphony of the Night, I believe, was the only... Yeah, so this is obviously drawing much more
64. I'm not sure when Legacy of Darkness came out.
To put this in perspective, this came out less than a year after Vanilla 64, and Vanilla 64 came out, like, I think 2 months after Ocarina of Time. So, it was very close to that game's release, which is why you can barely fucking see any possible influence from Ocarina of Time in this game. It exists in that oddball era where, you know...
Everyone was trying their own lock-on, everyone was trying their own camera control, that sort of shit.
Yeah. And to its credit, like, even vanilla Castlevania 64 has a pretty good auto-targeting system for attacking. You'll notice that, like, it's especially obvious with Reinhardt here because he's not charging up homing projectiles everywhere like Carrie does. But, like, he'll whip, like, directly toward an enemy, even if they're at an odd, awkward angle. And, once you get a handle on how the combat works, it works reliably.
I guess that's one of the benefits of having a whip, which is sort of like a semi-ranged weapon, is that you can just be like, okay, hit the closest thing. And it will
all the characters, by the way, have a ranged or semi-ranged weapon. Like, Reinhardt has the whip, Carrie has her magic bolts, Henry just has a fucking gun, and Cornell does the sonic boom from Street Fighter for some reason. I don't understand what's the connection between that and Werewolf. But, yeah, everyone has their ranged weapon. They also have their secondary weapon, which, as you saw in in Reinhardt's case, is his little short sword there. It's interesting that he has a sword, because, the only other, like, Belmont I can think of who was portrayed as wearing a sword, not necessarily using it, but wearing it, was Sonia Belmont, a character created by the same developers who made this game. So,
is Sonia Belmont from the GBA game?
She's the Game Boy games.
Legends. Game Boy Legends, yeah. Same company that made Legends. And,
so so the devs are like, oh, I hope they don't fucking retcon this out of existence. So why they do that?
Igarashi was kind of cold about retconning the shit out of Legends and 64. So, like...
Wait a minute, this is just the Rondo of Blood.
Like, ooh. Okay, so, elephant in the room. This is not the same first level you would have played if you played Vanilla 64. This level, which I call "What a Horrible Night to Have a Ritual," was added to Legacy of Darkness because the opening of Vanilla 64, after the very stunning first 2 minutes, which were great for setting the tone, was just kind of like a bunch of empty fields with infinitely spawning skeletons that you had to run back and forth across. Very boring. So, what we got instead here in Legacy of Darkness was an entirely new first level, and a completely redesigned version of the original first level as Stage 2.
I was about to comment that this dude moves very fucking weird, and then I realized, no, this is actually the logical conclusion of giving a serpent opposable thumbs. But it moves like a puppet. Anyway, go ahead.
Anyway, yeah. So we got a new opening stage and a new opening boss. So that's neat.
Man, and Bloodstained Symphony of the Night is not Symphony of the Night. What the fuck? What the hell? Ritual of the Night. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is
Ritual of the Night.
Castlevania 64 ripoff. Starting on a boat, man. What stories have ever started on
Rondo
a boat?
of Innocence.
Rondo of Innocence.
That's when you're trying to beat the allegations in court.
Rondo of Innocence.
Anyway, another thing that they added that wasn't in Vanilla 64 was the Fleaman. Fuck the
Oh
Fleaman.
boy, man.
I was going to say everyone's favorite enemy is back.
I should be using the sword to break the candles, but okay, so for my first Reinhardt playthrough, I decided that I didn't want to, like, misrepresent this game, because I am fully aware that even a shitty-ass game like Devil May Cry 2 can be made to look fun if you play it in a certain way. But, so, to make my case that Legacy of Darkness is worth your time, people, I decided that my first playthrough as Reinhardt would be semi-blind. Which is why I'm doing shit like that. Okay, so one of the control quirks of Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness is that you have to be facing in the direction you want to jump if you want to do a full jump. So you have to, like, wait a beat for your character to turn around when you turn them around. Otherwise, you'll jump too quickly. And if you jump too quickly, you'll do a little side hop, which is fine for dodging attacks, but absolute shit for platforming. So take care, you know. Take your time, as the Persona bots say.
I'm just imagining Reinhardt doing the Mario 64 side jump and stuff. He's like, Yahoo, yippee.
Yeah, can we just BLJ up to Castlevania, to Dracula's headquarters and call it a day?
You know,
one of these slightly awkward pacing issues of the Legacy of Darkness remixed beginning is that you get the first boss of, you get like the first like stage 1 recurring skeleton giant boss thing right after defeating the serpent.
Camera.
Yeah, actually, I was going to mention, because to me, if I was playing this game for the first time, that will kind of set, and from what I understand, an incorrect precedent where the game is mostly boss rushing. Because like you just mentioned, we just fought the serpent, and now we're immediately fighting another boss, the giant gorilla skeleton.
Who has 3
Is this like the
eyes.
only time they do this?
What this was like the main gimmick of the first stage in the original game was that, like, very early on, you'd bust open a gate on your way to the castle, and you'd have a short skirmish with the gorilla skeleton, and it would run away after a few hits like it's doing now, and then you would have to fight it again at the end of the stage. It's a bit weird to keep that pacing, but at least he jumps into the river and not onto the rising platform now, which was a thing he would absolutely do in the original, and it was jank as shit.
I understand.
Oh, I see. So it's supposed to be like, oh, this is our first encounter, and then you'll fight him later. But
yeah,
since this is no longer the first level, it's like...
Yeah.
Okay, well, where do you go?
It happens right after the serpent boss, and it's a little bit awkward.
Okay, so one thing I do want to say, I understand that N64 graphics, especially ones that attempt to do semi-realistic environments like this, have not aged the best. Especially when you compare it to Symphony of the Night. There's I think it's an EGM article, where it's just like, that people will often bring up, where it's just like, oh man, the cheesy 2D graphics of Symphony of the Night when you compare to the fully polygonal Castlevania 64.
That was just reviewer mindset in general.
Yeah, where
like you find that everywhere.
Yeah, I know that nowadays, most people would say that Symphony of the Night has aged gracefully, which it has, and this has not, which it hasn't really. But I would still say this game is doing a really good job conveying tone and mood.
I don't know, like I feel even the topic of something aging is losing more and more relevancy in a day and age where we'll not only just have, again, to mention indie titles specifically, like deliberate callbacks to like the retro era, well, like NES and Super Nintendo era, but like we're seeing more and more retro callbacks to the PlayStation 1 and N64 like style. So how would exactly you immediately explain something being dated that looks no different than what indie games of today are trying to harken back to? Like, what would you focus on? It's probably like controls, right? Controls or like the scenario setup. But visually, I feel just calling this game aged because it doesn't look like a AAA game of today is kind of losing some steam.
A little bit. I don't entirely agree, mostly because we don't have too many indie games that look like N64 PS1 games. The other, I think, resolution matters. 'Cause when you look at indie games that are trying to do the PS1 style, they're still at a higher resolution than obviously an NES 64 game would. So they're nowhere near as outright blurry.
I'll quickly disagree that there aren't as many. I think there are, it's just that we don't know about them unless they're really good.
I mean, so there certainly are less plentiful when you compare them to the 2D NES and SNES callback games, because those are literally a dime a dozen. There's a billion games that try to emulate that art style. There are definitely more and more 3D games that are attempting to call back to the play styles of N64, GameCube, and PS1, PS2 era games. You see much less. There are a handful. I'm not trying to say that they don't exist. You see much less games trying to call back to specifically this kind of era of graphics fidelity. I suppose there's just less nostalgia for it in general, which I guess kind of makes sense when you think about things for a moment. The SNES era of 2D graphics kind of lived on longer than you would think because of handheld gaming. The Game Boy Advance and DS had games with that sort of graphical 2D pixel art graphics go on after the SNES and Genesis died off. So in reality, you've got something more like 15 years of games where that was the primary...
25 plus, 25.
Yeah, it's a lot. So, generally speaking, that's a lot of people who played games and thus have an affinity for that kind of graphical style. Versus the jump between the N64 and the GameCube, I still think is in those eras, I should say, PS1, PS2, and so on. I still think that, in my mind, that is the largest jump in graphical fidelity among 3D consoles.
Easily, yeah.
So... And the PS1 and N64 honestly had a fairly short shelf time, like 96 to 2001-ish. So like 5 years. There's just not as many, unless if you were, 8 to 13 years old during 1996 through 2001, there's not that as many people who fit those requirements, So I think that's part of why we don't see as much nostalgia baiting for this specific era of graphics specifically. There's been more and more stuff that's aiming to this era of gameplay, which I appreciate, because honestly, even as someone who did grow up in that era, as much as I have a soft spot for this art style, I would prefer them to go with GameCube era or better graphics.
Okay,
personally.
So speaking of things that have aged poorly, the way this game handles like draw distance and stuff remaining loaded in, that tree that we just saw got struck by lightning twice. It got struck by lightning. Ooh, I almost fell. It got struck by lightning. It fell, and then we walked just a little bit away from it to flick that switch. And then it was back up and got struck by lightning again as we walked back down the same path.
Well, lightning's a real bully.
Yeah. To go back to Ted's point a little bit, I think the other thing is that, as someone who was around during this time period and remembers it, I think we all kind of admitted that the graphics weren't great for PS1 and 64. We kind of just dealt with it because that was what we had at the time. As far as 3D graphics go.
Disagree. What were great graphics in that era? What comparatively speaking? Because what are we comparing it to? No, like back then, like growing up, I thought Final Fantasy VII looked amazing.
Yeah,
I thought 9 looked incredible. I thought, despite not being able to play it, I thought Mario 64 looked pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I would not agree that even back then I knew this looks aged and it's like that. No, back then I thought it was incredible.
I mean, the fact that there's VHS lines going through the graphics kind of makes me think it's a little aged. I don't know about you.
Yeah, you gotta work on your tracking, Lewis.
I got lost, but that was my own stupid fault. I actually just like this is
nice use of Maria's credits theme there.
So this is going to happen a fair few times during my playthroughs, because there are things that waste your time a little bit, but this time it was entirely my own fault. This was also a very lucky decision on my part, because if you walk across the other bridge, it crumbles beneath your feet.
Is there a map in this game, or like a compass or something?
The levels are not complicated enough to really need a map, to be fair, but no, there is no map. Okay. This is a stage-based game. Symphony of the Night was very new around the time 64 came out, so the idea of Metroidvania design wasn't really a thing, and this is much more of an adaptation of Classicvania, just with like elements of survival horror exploration and Tomb Raider style adventure platforming thrown in. Oh god damn it.
Those friends, because hey, what the fuck? It was sleeping.
The red skeletons, these were not in the original game either, but they only appear here too. At least they only appear here in normal mode. But if you like destroy the spirit skulls, you turn the red skeletons into normal skeletons, and that's how you kill them. So that's interesting.
Oh yeah, that's pretty unique. Like, as normally red skeletons are just like the unkillable skeletons that you just bypass.
Does the day-night cycle do anything? Because I noticed there's a clock with a little sun, and there was a moon earlier.
So, like, the only other game I can think of off the top of my head that gives you a way to kill the red skeletons permanently is Portrait of Ruin, where you can either use the Undead Killer Whip, or the Sanctuary spell if you can get it off.
New Game Plus, that's actually a really cool, great way to level up really early, because red skeletons give you a shitload of EXP. What does what is the other thing that I was asking, like, the sun icon, whatever the hell he was talking about?
Okay,
I don't play Castlevania.
The day and night cycle is important specifically in Reinhardt and Carey's campaign. Not so much in Cornell's because he only has one ending. But like Simon's Quest, if you complete the game too slowly, you get the bad ending.
Wait, there's a time limit in Simon's Quest?
Yes.
I did not know that. Wow.
There are actually 3 different endings depending on how quickly you beat the game. Although in the American translation, they assigned the incorrect text to the endings, so you get the good ending text with the bad ending, and it's really embarrassing.
What?
Man, Simon's Quest with the retranslation mod is actually fairly good. I would recommend trying it, but you know, I've probably already thrown my Castlevania tastes into question by saying this is an actually good edition of Castlevania 64.
There's nothing wrong with having perspective, because I got a feeling most people that would just immediately dismiss this game have never actually played it.
What?
Gather around, children. Let me tell you the story. Actually play the game for yourself.
Here's an interesting change. Okay, this werewolf just randomly appears in the middle of the fucking level in the original 64 in just this random-ass wide-open field where a bunch of regular-ass skeletons are spawning like they do everywhere else, right? It doesn't have a boss camera. It doesn't have a health bar. It's just a really annoying and hard-hitting enemy that ambushes you in the middle of the level at random for no reason.
Just werewolf jump scare.
It's extremely annoying to hit in that version too, because the camera doesn't... Oh, god damn it. They gave me a use key so that I don't accidentally pick up the knife when I've got a better sub-weapon, and I still manage to do it all the time. But, like, yeah, the werewolf just randomly appears in the middle of the original level, and it's just like, why are you here? And the only other place it appears is Reinhardt's Duel Tower stage. Ugh.
Are we back at the beginning of the level?
No.
Okay,
Although this is another interesting change. A lot of people complained about how slippery and precise the platforming in the original was. All of these little platform climbing sequences were in the original level, but they were a lot narrower. And that is actually a level design change theme that I noticed throughout the early game, is that they got rid of a lot of the narrowest platforms. They're still in the late game, but not in the early game, which is good, because they improved the control between the two versions, but it's still not great for precise platforming.
It's interesting to me to see, because this game you said came out like a year after the original?
Less than a year, yeah.
Less than a year. Like, it's funny to me that this would be like a DLC pack or a free update to a game if it were to come out in modern day. But they just didn't have the ability to do that back in 1999 or whenever this game came out. So they just had to release a new game. in order to do it, in order to add all this stuff.
Well, the other thing is that, like, when they were developing and teasing pre-release information about Castlevania 64, they had a much more ambitious plan for the original game that involved 4 campaigns rather than the 2 we got, and a much more involved story than what we eventually got, too. You can sort of see the bones and cartilage of that much more involved story going on in
Was that intentional?
Yes, it was. But, like, you know, there's a potentially good story in Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness, but it doesn't really have the room to develop all the little threads it's got going on. So what you wind up getting is Malice appearing twice in the entire game before the big twist at the end. Or Charlie Vincent appearing exactly one time, even though he's the key to the good and bad endings. It's very strange. Cornell's story has more meat on its bones in terms of story presentation, but it's very obvious that they had more planned than what we got. And that's a shame, you know?
Fighting skeletons in the 3D space will never not be funny to me.
Well, it just makes you think that you're in Jason and the Argonauts, you know?
You say Jason and the Argonaut, I think of Army of Darkness.
I've never seen Army of Darkness, so...
Oh, my God.
We've gone over this like 5 times. I'm a wimpy, tiny baby.
I think...
And cannot handle anything
Army of
scary.
Darkness, it's not even a horror movie. It's a comedy.
I thought that the third one was the one that was comedic, and the first 2 were actually scary.
Yeah. Army of Darkness is the third movie.
Then what was the first 2?
Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2.
Weren't those also scary?
Those are straight up horror movies.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, they are horror movies before anything else, but they also have dark. They're dark comedies.
Yeah.
But they're more in line with horror than Army of Darkness is straight up comedy.
Going from Evil Dead 2 to Army of Darkness is like going from Resident Evil 3 to Resident Evil 4.
Yes. Yeah, not lying, actually.
Okay, so this boss actually did receive a few changes between Vanilla 64 and Legacy of Darkness. Probably because they realized that when they introduced the Sea Serpent in the Foggy Lake level, they kind of like gave you a harder boss to start off than the level 1 boss they originally had. So it has this electrified, like, gas breath phase added into its normal moveset. It doesn't actually make the boss much harder, though.
Because you have a ranged attack.
Well, yeah. But, like, when it's electrified, its entire body becomes a hitbox, rather than just its club being a hitbox. Yeah, its club is always a hitbox for some reason. I don't understand that.
It's like a revelation here. I can barely hear the music because we're talking over it, but I think this is the same one that Circle of Moon uses in the GBA game.
It might be. There's
kind of having a revelation here.
There's a couple remixes in Castlevania's in Legacy of Darkness's soundtrack. One of Cornell's stages actually just has the Atlantis theme from Bloodlines, and it's great.
Well, the thing is, though, Legacy of Darkness predates Circle of Moon, so Circle of Moon reused a 64 track.
Ah.
That was actually one thing that I was wondering about, because
Circle of Moon's a fraud.
This first stage didn't have music playing throughout most of it. Is that the norm, or does the rest of the game have music?
The first stage in Vanilla 64 put a lot of effort into atmosphere, so it didn't really have a stage theme like some of the other levels did. It was just quiet and somber, and you were running around like desolate fields fighting skeletons, and I'm sure it sounded very nice on paper, and for the first 3 minutes of the stage, it's actually really good as a tone setter. But it was boring to play through. Oh my god. So yeah, we got 2 completely new level designs to go through to replace that one long, boring stage. And that is the first sign that Legacy of Darkness is just an all-around improvement. But we'll see where it goes next level.
Ooh.